When Louis Gossett Jr. passed away, his grand estate in Malibu, a sprawling property overlooking the Pacific, stood empty for months. The house, built in the 1920s, had been his sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection. But those who had visited him in his final years whispered about strange occurrences: flickering lights, distant voices, and the sensation of being watched. It wasn't long before new owners came along. Jacob and Emily Turner, a young couple from Chicago, had spent years saving to move to California. Jacob, an independent filmmaker, was drawn to the house's history, while Emily, a former journalist, fell in love with its classic architecture. It was the kind of home that seemed to hold stories within its walls, and they were eager to be part of its next chapter. But from the first night, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. Emily would hear soft jazz music playing from nowhere, only for it to stop the moment she tried to find the source. Jacob found the home office door locked from the inside when no one had touched it. Then came the shadows, figures moving in the hallway when both of them were in bed. One evening, as Jacob was reviewing footage for a documentary, he caught something chilling: a reflection in the glass of his office window. A tall, commanding figure stood behind him, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Jacob turned instantly. No one was there. Emily, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as stress. "It's just our minds playing tricks," she told Jacob. But she couldn't explain the voices. Low murmurs in the study, an occasional chuckle in the living room. One night, she awoke to the distinct scent of cigar smoke, Louis Gossett Jr.'s favorite, though neither of them smoked. Desperate for answers, they invited a historian to visit, who revealed something fascinating. Gossett Jr. had often spoken of feeling a presence in the house himself. He believed that spirits of old Hollywood lingered in homes like his, remnants of an era refusing to fade. And now, perhaps, he had joined them. Jacob and Emily had a choice: leave or learn to live with whatever remained. They chose to stay. The disturbances never stopped, but they never felt threatening. In fact, over time, it seemed as if the spirit, if it was Gossett Jr., was simply watching over his beloved home. And so, the Turners made peace with their unseen guest. Some nights, when Jacob worked late, he'd leave a glass of bourbon on the desk, the way Louis liked it. In the morning, it was always untouched. But Jacob swore some nights, just before he drifted to sleep, he'd hear the quiet clink of a glass being raised in a silent toast. The Turners had been in the house for 3 months when they stopped questioning the disturbances. The flickering lights, the faint murmurs in the hallway, the scent of cigars curling through the study at midnight, these things no longer startled them. They had settled into an uneasy coexistence with whatever remained of the past, adapting as one does to the hum of an old refrigerator or the creaks of a settling home. But there were moments when the air in the house would shift, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting. One evening, Jacob was alone in the den, reviewing footage for a new project. Emily had fallen asleep early, and the house was hushed except for the occasional roll of waves against the cliffs outside. The room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of the computer screen, its flickering light casting long shadows across the leather armchairs and dark wood-paneled walls. It was then that he felt it. Presence. Not menacing, not even particularly cold, but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, and an odd sensation crawled up his arms, a feeling not of being watched, but of being observed, studied, measured, weighed. He turned his head slowly, half expecting to see Emily standing in the doorway, drowsy and confused. But no one was there. Then a sound. A deep, low chuckle. The kind of laughter that comes from a man who has lived long enough to see the patterns in life repeat themselves. It came from just behind his shoulder, warm yet distant, as if drifting through the years to find him. Jacob did not move. He hardly breathed. The laughter faded, swallowed by the stillness of the room. He sat frozen, fingers resting lightly on his keyboard, his heart thudding against his ribs. When he finally summoned the courage to turn his head, the den was as it had always been, books neatly stacked, a glass of water on the side table, a forgotten script resting under a bronze paperweight. Nothing had changed. But as his eyes settled on the desk in the far corner, He saw something he could not explain. The old leather chair, the one they had never bothered to move from the study when they first arrived, the one that had belonged to Louis Gossett Jr. himself, was no longer empty. It was turned slightly, angled toward him, as if someone had been sitting there watching and had just now, in the quiet of the moment, risen and walked away. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Jacob stared at the chair, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The leather, cracked with time and softened by years of use, gleamed faintly in the dim glow of the desk lamp. It had not been that way before. He was certain of it. The chair had always faced the bookshelves, tucked neatly beneath the desk, undisturbed. Now it was slightly turned, not in a dramatic horror movie fashion, but subtly, as if someone had sat there not long ago, shifting their weight, observing the room in quiet contemplation before standing and slipping away. The air in the study was thick with something unseen, a presence that did not announce itself but made itself known in the way an old song might stir a memory long buried. Jacob felt no fear, only an uncanny sense of proximity, as though he had just missed someone. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair. The floor creaked beneath him, the wood groaning under his movement. He took a hesitant step toward the desk, half expecting the chair to move again, half hoping it wouldn't. The scent of cigar smoke was stronger now, laced with something else, a faint trace of cologne, warm and nostalgic, the kind an older gentleman might wear to a formal event. Jacob reached out, fingers grazing the smooth, time-worn armrest. The leather was cool beneath his touch, yet his skin prickled with the sensation of lingering warmth, as though someone had just been there, their presence dissipating into the silence. The thought unnerved him, but he could not walk away. He eased into the chair, his body fitting into its contours with an odd sense of familiarity. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing in the old sense, staring at the shelves lined with books that had belonged to a man he had never met. Then a whisper, not a word, not even a voice, but the distinct impression of sound. A breath against the stillness, a murmur just beyond his understanding. Jacob turned sharply. The study was empty, and yet he knew with an inexplicable certainty that he was not alone. Emily awoke to the sound of music. Soft, distant jazz, barely perceptible, like a record playing in another room with the door slightly ajar. She blinked against the darkness, her mind still thick with sleep. For a moment, she thought Jacob had left the television on again. But as she sat up, rubbing her eyes, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the living room. It was closer, the study. She swung her legs over the bed, shivering as the cool air met her skin. The old house was never truly silent. It creaked and whispered as old houses do, shifting in the night, breathing in the ocean air. But this was different. This was deliberate. Barefoot, she padded down the hallway, her pulse quickening with each step. The study door was open, and from within, the low hum of a saxophone drifted into the hall. Jacob sat at the desk, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the computer screen. He was still unmoving, as if transfixed by something unseen. "Jake!" He didn't answer. Emily stepped closer, her gaze darting around the room. The bookshelves stood undisturbed, the windows shut against the night. And yet, the air felt thick, alive with something beyond her comprehension. She reached out, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. He flinched, his body tensing beneath her touch. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob exhaled slowly, as if pulling himself back from somewhere distant. "The chair," he murmured. It moved. Emily glanced at it, its position unchanged. "Jacob, are you sure?" A pause, then a nod. "There was something here," he said, his voice quieter now. "I felt someone. And the music, do you hear it?" Emily frowned. "Hear what?" Jacob's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He shook his head. "Nothing. Never mind." But as Emily turned to leave, she hesitated. The air carried a scent she couldn't quite place, rich and nostalgic, like old wood and smoke and something else, something familiar. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, from somewhere beyond the study, from the depths of the house itself, came the faintest sound. A footstep, slow, measured, and then the quiet creak of a door closing somewhere deep within the house. The sound lingered in the silence, stretching into the walls, seeping into the wooden beams of the house. A single footstep, a measured pause, and then the distant hush of a door settling into its frame. Neither Jacob nor Emily moved. Emily felt her breath tighten in her throat. The house was old wooden frames shifted with the wind. Floorboards contracted in the night air. She wanted to tell herself that's all it was. But deep inside, in a part of her mind that she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew this was something else. Jacob's gaze was fixed beyond her, toward the open doorway of the study, where the hallway stretched into shadow. His jaw was tense, fingers gripping the armrests of the old leather chair. The chair that had moved. The chair that still smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to speak. That came from inside the house. Jacob nodded. His expression was unreadable. He pushed himself up slowly from the chair, standing in the dim glow of the desk lamp, the shifting light casting uneasy shadows along the bookshelves. The scent of smoke and old cologne still clung to the air, heavier now, like someone had just walked past. Without a word, he stepped forward, past Emily, into the hallway. She followed instinctively, her bare feet pressing into the cool hardwood. The hallway stretched before them, long and quiet, the framed photographs along the walls catching slivers of light from the study. Their own reflections shimmered faintly in the glass, ghost-like, distorted. At the far end of the hall, the house split into two directions, one leading to the kitchen and dining area, the other toward the bedrooms. But the sound they had heard, that creak of a door, Emily was sure it had come from neither. It had come from somewhere deeper, somewhere past the places they had explored since moving in. Jacob reached the end of the hallway and stopped. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine as she joined him. She hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now, standing there in the silence, she realized there was another door, not quite hidden but easily overlooked. It was set into the wall just past the guest room, its dark wooden frame blending almost seamlessly with the shadows. The brass handle gleamed in the dim light. Emily had assumed it was just a closet, but now, standing before it, she felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Jacob reached for the handle. "Wait," she whispered. He paused, his fingers resting just shy of the brass. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. She could feel his hesitation, the same unspoken thought tightening between them. Whatever was behind that door, they were not supposed to find it. A gust of wind rattled the windows in the distance, and for a moment, Emily swore she heard it again, the faintest murmur of a voice. Not in the hallway, not in the study, but behind the door. Jacob turned the handle. It moved easily, without resistance, without the groan of age she had expected. The door swung inward, revealing not a closet, but a narrow staircase leading down. A basement. Emily's stomach clenched. "There's no basement on the floor plans." Jacob glanced at her. "Then what is this?" She peered down the steps. They descended into darkness, the wooden slats rough and unfinished, the air curling up from below thick and stale. A single light switch sat just inside the frame. Jacob flicked it. A weak yellow glow buzzed to life, illuminating a cramped space below. And that was when they saw it. Not a basement, not a storage room, a study, a second study, smaller than the one upstairs, but nearly identical in layout. A desk, a bookshelf, a worn leather chair just like the one in the study above. The air down here was colder, denser, as if it had been sealed off for years. But the dust had been disturbed. Someone had been here. And then Emily saw it, the thing that made her breath catch in her throat. On the desk, beside an old-fashioned radio and a neatly stacked pile of papers, was a glass tumbler, half full. The amber liquid inside it gleamed faintly in the dim light. Fresh, not old, not forgotten. Someone had poured that drink recently. And in the stillness of the hidden study, As the two of them stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, the radio crackled to life. A deep, rich voice. Smooth, familiar. A voice neither of them had ever heard in person, but had listened to in films, in interviews, in recordings. Louis Gossett Jr. "Make yourselves at home," the voice said. The radio clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jacob and Emily stood frozen at the foot of the narrow staircase, their bodies stiff, their breath shallow. The dim glow of the single hanging bulb cast uneasy shadows across the small, secret study. The bookshelves were lined with old hardcovers, their spines cracked with time, the wood of the desk polished smooth from years of use. The scent of leather, old paper, and bourbon lingered in the stale air. Emily's gaze remained locked on the tumbler of amber liquid resting on the desk. The way it caught the light, the way the faintest ripple disturbed its surface, it was impossible to ignore. It had been poured recently. Someone had been sitting there, drinking, thinking. And then they had left. Or had they? Jacob swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. His fingers flexed at his sides before clenching into fists. "Did you hear that?" he murmured, though he already knew the answer. Emily nodded slowly. Her eyes darted to the old-fashioned radio that sat on the desk, its knobs dulled with age, its speaker covered in a thin layer of dust except for the center, where the dust had been disturbed. Someone had touched it. Recently. She forced herself to move, to step forward, though every instinct in her body screamed against it. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned in protest, the sound swallowed by the low ceiling and the heavy air of the hidden room. Jacob followed, his movements slow, deliberate, as if any sudden gesture might disrupt whatever unspoken rule they had just broken. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breathing controlled but uneven. His eyes remained locked on the chair behind the desk. It was identical to the one in the study upstairs, dark brown leather, high-backed, worn down by years of use. But there was something different about it, something unsettling. It was warm. Emily hesitated before reaching out, her fingertips grazing the smooth leather of the armrest. A chill ran through her. The chair was not just warm, it was occupied warmth, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago and had only just risen when they arrived. She pulled her hand back sharply. "Jacob," she whispered, barely audible. He didn't look at her. His eyes were still on the radio. Emily's heart pounded as she followed his gaze. The old device sat there, unmoving, silent. But she could still hear the voice, rich, deep, unmistakable. "Make yourselves at home." She wet her lips, trying to summon logic. "It could be a recording," she said, though even she didn't believe it. "Maybe some kind of old interview that got triggered when the power came on?" Jacob exhaled, shaking his head. "No." His voice was low, almost reluctant. "That wasn't a recording." He stepped closer to the desk, his fingers hovering over the radio's tuning dial. The dust was disturbed in smudged streaks, like someone had been using it frequently, adjusting the frequency with care. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Who else knew about this room?" Emily shook her head. "No one told us about a basement. It wasn't in the listing." They both turned, looking around the space more carefully now. The study was cramped but methodical. The books on the shelves weren't haphazardly stacked or left to decay. Someone had been taking care of them. The desk was organized, the papers neatly aligned, a pen resting beside a leather-bound notebook. This wasn't an abandoned space. It was lived in. Jacob reached for the notebook, his fingers brushing the worn cover. He hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. The pages were filled with handwriting, elegant, slanted, the ink dark against the yellowed paper. Emily moved closer, peering over his shoulder. The words on the first page were crisp, clear. "A man's home is his story." Jacob turned the page. More writing, long paragraphs, dated entries. Thoughts, reflections, pieces of memory captured in ink. But the handwriting, it wasn't old. The ink had not faded. The strokes were fresh. Emily traced her fingers along the margin of the paper. This isn't decades old," she whispered. Jacob's stomach twisted. The last entry was dated 3 days ago. They both stared at the notebook in silence, the weight of realization settling heavily between them. Then, a sound. Not from the radio, not from upstairs, from the far end of the hidden study. A soft click, like the sound of a door unlocking. Jacob's head snapped toward the noise, his breath sharp in his chest. Emily stiffened beside him. They hadn't noticed it before. A second door, tucked into the back wall, barely visible in the dim light. The wood blended into the paneling, so subtle that it had seemed like nothing more than part of the wall itself. But now, standing in that dense silence, they saw it for what it was. A passage, and it had just unlocked itself. Neither of them moved. The air in the study felt heavier now, thick with something unseen but undeniable. Emily's fingers tightened around Jacob's arm. He swallowed. The door was open, just enough to see the darkness beyond. And somewhere in that darkness, a presence lingered, waiting. Jacob and Emily stood frozen, their breath shallow, their skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. The hidden door, previously sealed, previously invisible, was now ajar, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The house had led them here, to this moment, to whatever was waiting in the dark. Jacob stepped forward first. His fingers brushed against the edge of the door, the wood cool beneath his touch. The silence stretched between them, heavy and expectant. Then, with a slow inhale, he pushed it open. Corridor, narrow, unlit. The scent of old wood and something faintly metallic filled the air. The walls, lined with aged wooden planks, stretched forward into the unknown. Emily hesitated before following. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door behind them creaked a soft, deliberate sound before it swung shut. They didn't turn back. The hallway led to a second room, smaller than the study, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb swaying faintly as though disturbed by movement. And in the center, a chair, not like the ones in the studies. This one was older, stripped of comfort, its wooden frame weathered and worn. Resting on the seat was something both ordinary and profoundly unsettling. A single cigar still smoldering. The tendrils of smoke curled lazily into the air, filling the space with the unmistakable scent of tobacco. Jacob's breath hitched. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. The air shifted, a whisper of movement. Emily's fingers dug into Jacob's arm as a shadow flickered at the far end of the room. Then, a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, standing just beyond the reach of the swaying light. The shape of a man. And then, unmistakably, he stepped forward. Louis Gossett Jr., or something that still felt like him. His expression was unreadable, his presence commanding yet strangely calm. His deep-set eyes met Jacob's with something almost amused. "Finally found it, huh?" he murmured, voice as smooth as ever. Jacob couldn't speak. Emily exhaled shakily. "But you're dead." The ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "Nah, not in this house." The silence stretched. Then he turned, walking past them toward the door. As he passed, the air around them warmed, the scent of his cologne and cigar smoke thickening, wrapping around them like the last moments of a dream before waking. "Y'all best get upstairs now," he said over his shoulder. "Wouldn't want to be down here after dark." And then he was gone, just like that. The bulb flickered once, then died, plunging the room into darkness. A breath, presence still lingering. Then, the door behind them burst open, flooding the hallway with warm, golden light from the study above. Without hesitation, without a single word, Jacob and Emily ran. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.